Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and finally, welcome back to Final Fantasy XIV Versus. I know, it's taken forever to get this done, but it's here, so let's do the video. In this series, we compare jobs within the same role to determine which of these jobs is the right one for you. In this video, we'll be covering the 3 caster DPS in the game. 3 caster DPS. This is just a friendly comparison of the jobs and should not dissuade anyone from playing the one that they like. It's also not a guide, but I'll include resources to guides in the description of the video. Alright, let's kick things off with Final Fantasy XIV's OG caster DPS, Black Mage. As the master of the Astral and Umbral arts, Black Mage alternates between periods of immense damage and a recharge period where it replenishes its MP to prepare to unleash more damage. This is accomplished through its 2 forms with stacking buffs, Astral Fire and Umbral Ice. When casting most fire spells, the Black Mage maintains Astral Fire, reducing their MP regeneration to 0, raising the MP cost of fire spells, but also causing them to deal increased damage. When casting most ice spells, they instead enter Umbral Ice, rapidly restoring their MP. They also reduce the MP cost of the opposite element to 0 once you're a high enough level, and at 3 stacks even reduce the cast time of the opposite element. Black Mages traditionally swap between these 2 forms using Fire 3 to enter Astral Fire and Blizzard 3 to enter Umbral Ice. These spells both generate 3 stacks of the corresponding buff instantly, and with that halved cast time and 0 MP cost, are the most reliable means of swapping between forms in single target situations. Fire and Blizzard 1 can extend the duration of the forms for single targets, as can Fire 2 and Blizzard 2 in AoEs, but these tools see very limited use at higher levels thanks to other skills the job obtains. Once a high enough level, Black Mages will obtain a personal buff called Enochian, and you live and breathe and die by this buff. This not only grants them permanent increases in damage so long as they never lose Astral Fire or Umbral Ice, but also access to 2 key spells, Fire 4 and Blizzard 4. In Astral Fire phases, Black Mages want to cast as many Fire 4s as possible before swapping back to Umbral Ice. However, the spell doesn't refresh Astral Fire, so a single Fire 1 is needed to extend that and get the most out of their damage phases. In Umbral Ice, Black Mages want to make sure they use Blizzard 4 a single time to gain 3 Umbral Hearts. These hearts negate the increased cost of fire spells in Astral Fire for 3 spells, so it'll basically make your first 3 Fire 4s cost less MP. You can also spend them all at once to reduce the cost of the spell Flare by 1/3. We'll talk a little bit more about Flare later. At the end of every Astral Fire phase, Black Mages will want to use Despair as well once they obtain it. This spell consumes all of the remaining MP for a really high damage hit, making it the perfect finisher before swapping to Umbral Ice. It does recharge your Astral Fire duration, so it does have some extended uses as well. Now, by maintaining Enochian, Black Mages eventually gain access to another resource called Polyglot. This stacks up to 2 and can be used to cast either Foul or Xenoglossy. Foul is a high damage AoE, and Xenoglossy is a high damage single target spell. Obviously, Foul for AoE, and Xenoglossy for single targets. The nice thing about Xenoglossy in particular is that it's instant cast, making it a great tool for fights with high movement. It's not entirely about expending your Polyglot ASAP either. You can instead make sure to just never overcap on Polyglot and use them specifically for mobility or burst phases. Now that we got the basics down, Black Mage does have a number of other tools. For one, they have a whole nother element, Thunder Spells. This doesn't interact with your Astral Fire or Umbral Ice phases, but it is another resource you'll have to maintain. Thunder 3 is a single target dot, and Thunder 4 is an AoE dot. These evolve from Thunder 1 and Thunder 2 at the earlier levels. These will usually be cast during Umbral Ice in order to fish for Thundercloud procs. This trait causes the dot from Thunder Spells to occasionally grant a buff of the same name, which will make the next Thunder spell instant cast, cost no MP, deal all of its dot damage up front as direct damage, and then place another dot on the affected target. These procs are also great for mobility and damage sake, but must be weighed carefully against where the Black Mage is in their rotation, and this will take a bit of mastery. They also have an AoE rotation you can use. We've already mentioned Foul and Thunder 4, but we did also say Fire 2 and Blizzard 2 see next to no use at the higher levels. Instead, Black Mages make use of Freeze and Flare, their AoE form swapping spells. Freeze grants Umbral Ice 3 and a single Umbral Heart, while Flare grants Astral Fire 3 and deals high AoE damage at the cost of all the player's MP. Of course, if you have an Umbral Heart, that gets mitigated like we mentioned earlier, making it possible to cast multiple Flares in a row. There's a few different AoE rotations, and of course you're going to be mixing in Thunder, Four, and Foul between these freezes and flares. Finally, movement and DPS tools. These skills are mostly used to keep pumping out spells or for slightly extending Astral Fire phases. Ley Lines creates a spell circle that increases only the Black Mage who casted its spell speed when standing in them. Don't try to stand in another Black Mage's Ley Lines, it doesn't work. This doubles as a teleport point for between the lines, which jumps the Black Mage to their Ley Lines if they're active. They can also jump to an ally using Ethereal Manipulation for even more movement, though your teammate better be in the right spot when you use it. Next is Sharpcast, which causes the next spell that has an additional effect to automatically trigger that effect, meaning it can be used on a Thunder spell to force a Thundercloud proc, or Fire 1 for a Firestarter proc. Oh right, we didn't mention that. Fire 1 sometimes has a chance to trigger Firestarter, which gives you an instant cast, 0 MP, Fire 3. It's great for even more movement or for just basic use in the traditional Astral Fire rotation. Then there's Triple Cast, which makes your next 3 spells instant cast. This is fantastic for movement, and is actually an active DPS increase as well, since the cast time of Fire 4 is longer than your global cooldown. Using Triple Cast on those Fire 4s will eliminate that, so it ends up being like a giant spell speed buff almost. Then there's Umbral Soul, which grants Umbral Ice and 1 Umbral Heart, and you'll usually use this during downtimes when there are no targets to attack to maintain Enoki and continue to generate Polyglot and have some Umbral Hearts waiting for you when you finally get back to Astral Fire. You do need to make sure you're on Umbral Ice to use it, and you will have a tool for that just in case you're not prepared for it. Then there's Mana Font, which restores 30% of your MP instantly. This is great for occasionally performing an extra Astral Fire finisher of Fire 4 plus Despair during party buffs or to finish a target off. It also has use in AoEs to use more flares. Then we have some other defensive tools and utilities. There's Mana Ward, which simply creates a damage barrier equal to 30% of the Black Mage's max health. It's great for any time where you're going to be taking large amount of damage to help keep yourself alive. Finally is Transpose. This swaps the Black Mage's current alignment between Astral Fire and Umbral Ice. When it swaps you though, it only swaps you with a single stack, so it's mostly used in low-level stance swapping before you obtain Fire 3 and Blizzard 3. At max level, you can also use it to swap to Umbral Ice when you have no targets, so you can get to that Umbral Soul spamming we mentioned earlier. Okay, so everything I just said is from a script I wrote months ago, and I just noticed I didn't mention a few skills. Sleep is one of them, and that can be used to put enemies to sleep. It mostly goes unused, except in some class quests, and also in exploration content actually. It's pretty handy in there. There's also Scathe, which is an instant cast spell that occasionally deals double damage. So I went to double check to see if Scathe had any unique uses that I should make sure to mention, and the guide that I found on the Balance Discord, which is located below, literally said the first thing I read was, don't use this ability. Unfortunate. So that's a pretty lengthy explanation by Final Fantasy XIV Versus Series standards, but we're not even done yet. We still gotta talk about the pros and cons, and fortunately for Black Mage, they're pretty simple. Though every pro and con we name could kind of fit into either category. The job has an incredibly simple rotation, but it requires complete mastery over every individual fight and the movement required to maintain your spellcasting uptime. This can make the job scarier than it may seem in endgame rating, but the payoff is very tangible. It really does feel great to improve on this job, more so than any job in the game in my opinion. It doesn't really have any sort of raid buffs or debuffs outside of the role actions that all the casters have, but its personal DPS is so high that when played correctly, it's largely a non-factor for groups with good Black Mages. The only real con I'd say is that it's the only caster DPS without the ability to resurrect other players, but the job's performance in the game's lowered reliance on constant resurrections in the hardest content has lowered the impact of this con significantly. It's a really intimidating job, but if you can learn it and play it well, you're gonna have a great time. The second job in this Versus is Summoner. This branch of the Arcanist class focuses on maintaining dots and building up to its most powerful summons in combat. At base, the job is accompanied by one of 3 Eggies, Ifrit, Garuda, or Titan. Ifrit is usually used for single target DPS, and Garuda for AoE DPS. Titan is a little bit of a mixed bag. He doesn't actually tank for you anymore, so calling him the tank pet feels wrong. However, you can use him to generate a shield on yourself, which can be great when bosses jump away or when you just need a little bit of extra defense against a big attack. Now this shield and other skills from the Eggies are activated using the Eggie Assault 1 and 2 actions. These skills each tap into the Eggie and command it to perform one of its non-basic attacks. Summoners can store up to 4 charges to spend on Eggy Assaults, and each time one is used, the summoner gains access to Ruin 4, a powerful instant cast spell. Since both Eggy Assaults and Ruin 4 are instant, this is a great part of summoners' mobility when needed. They can also enkindle their pets every couple of minutes to invoke their most powerful attack. Now, the pets are the most basic thing about Summoner, but their rotation itself flows between one of 3 stages. Stage 1 is entering Dreadworm Trance, a short buff that makes your spell casting instant for most of your spells, resets a certain skill we'll talk about in a second, and grants 2 units of Dreadworm Ether once the form wears off or is expended. The trance can instantly be ended upon using Death Flare, a high potency AoE attack. Now, after you exit Dreadworm Trance, you can use that ether you generated to bring about a Demi Bahamut for a short time. This allows you to unleash massive damage on your foes and will be something you do fairly frequently. After Demi Bahamut is gone, your next Dreadworm Trance will instead be transformed into Firebird Trance, summoning the Firebird Phoenix for the summoner's ultimate form. The summoner gets more powerful versions of their basic spells, the Phoenix unleashes a ton of damage, and the party even gets gradually healed during this big finale. Once the Phoenix passes, the process begins anew until you may again summon Demi Bahamut and Phoenix. Mind you that Enkindle does not work with Bahamut and Phoenix, whose ultimate skills are activated through a different button entirely. Now, like Scholar from our healer verses, Summoner also generates stacks of a resource called Ether Flow, though in a very different manner. While Scholars use Energy Drain to consume their Ether Flow stacks, Summoners use Energy Drain to generate 2 stacks of the resource every 30 seconds. They may also use Energy Siphon as an AoE option to generate these stacks, sharing the cooldown with Energy Drain. Now, these stacks are spent on one of 2 skills, either Fester for single target damage or Pain Flare for AoE. Fester also has synergy with Summoner's Bio and Miasma dots, dealing more damage to the target so long as they're applied. Maintaining these dots on your primary target, and as well as many additional targets as possible, is vital to the job's performance. Try Disaster will allow a summoner to instantly place both dots on a single enemy, and is constantly reset by activating Dreadworm Trance. This gets the ball rolling on your primary target, but in AoE cases you'll want to spread these dots to other enemies. Bane helps you do that, allowing the summoner to infect enemies next to the target with any dots applied to it. Other than that, the job does have some utility outside of role actions. Summoners can resurrect allies in combat, though without Swift Cast you probably won't be doing that very often. They also have Ether Pact, which commands their current pet to emanate a devotion aura. This increases nearby party members' damage by 5% for 15 seconds. And to top it all off, they give a little bit of party healing over time when they summon Phoenix like we mentioned earlier. It's not a lot, but I'm not going to complain about it, especially compared to their Physics spell, which may as well not exist. So the pros of Summoner. For one, it's a very involved job for people who like to stay busy with button inputs. Managing dots, pet actions, Dreadworm Trance, Firebird Trance. It sounds complicated, but it fits together in one flowing rotation from start to finish. Despite this, the job also has great mobility, especially with the recent changes to Eggy Assault skills. It has incredibly potent single target and AoE DPS, and honestly is comparable to its fellow caster in this video, Black Mage. This feels especially good on fights with 2 targets, but even more than that also feels pretty good, so long as you can maintain dots on all of them. Not to mention it even has a combat resurrection, which can be pretty handy in a pinch. Or in 24-mans where your healer dies way too much. The cons of the Summoner, though, again, kind of match the pros in a lot of ways. That busyness of the job can be off-putting for a lot of players, even after the 5.1 changes. The flow of the job is great in a perfect world as well, but it's very rigid. Even worse is that if you die at any point, getting back into the flow of your rotation is incredibly punishing, and honestly just offsets your rotation from the rest of your party's strongest attacks. Even outside of death, encounters with lots of very weak targets can be kinda awkward to optimize gameplay on, since the general gameplay loop involves placing dots on targets before nuking them. This depends on the nature in which the monsters appear, but the recent final boss of the raid tier had an especially weird phase for summoners. Finally, pet commands are sometimes a bit unresponsive. Skills can be clipped and completely ghost, meaning that they activate without actually producing the effect, if tied in too close in conjunction to certain other skills. Demi Bahamut and Phoenix sometimes just ghost their basic attacks, instead choosing to come and give you a big ol' hug. Oh, and the Eggies look lame. And who knows when more Eggy Glamour's coming. That actually isn't a con, but if I didn't mention it, summoners would have me gutted. Let's just get an update in the upcoming live letter. Now, the final job for this video is the most recent addition to the caster lineup, Red Mage. This spellslinger first casts its various spells based on popular white and black magic spells to generate resources called black and white mana respectively. They maintain a balance between these two resources that is kept just slightly off from perfect. When they reach an upper threshold with both of these resources, they can jump into melee range and expend it on a quick and powerful series of sword thrusts and slashes. After executing a quick melee combo, they can then unleash 2 finishing attacks. One is a choice between a powerful black and white magic finisher, Verflare or Verholy, with the one you use being based on which mana resource you kept slightly higher. After unleashing one of those, they finally execute their final combo finisher, Scorch, for even more big damage. Now while they're building up this resource, red mages also have a unique trait in that of dual cast. This makes it so that for every spell that you actually cast, the next spell will be cast instantly. Since certain spells like Thunder and Arrow have a whopping 5-second cast time, you'll only want to use these spells while under the effect of dual cast. There is some optimization to be had there, especially in your opener, but that's just the general rule in combat. You can trigger the effect by casting Red Mage's basic Jolt spell, obtaining the effect, and then casting these other spells to deal damage and generate black or white mana. However, when casting Thunder or Arrow, you sometimes trigger another effect that lets you cast Fire or Stone, which further increase their respective mana types and cast at a normal rate like Jolt. These then trigger dual cast, which you can then again use on the longer spells. Bouncing back and forth between the elements while tracking these procs is actually a fairly streamlined experience so long as you can properly generate nearly equal amounts of both mana type. Now, failure to maintain any sort of balance actually causes the lesser element to generate less mana, delaying your overall rotation until you get them back in line. As for the melee side of things, using your melee combo directly expends the mana you've generated, assuming you have enough. Without enough mana, the skills are weak and slow. With enough mana, they greatly increase in speed and power, as well as trigger the Verflare, Verholy, and Scorch part of the rotation we mentioned earlier. Now you always want just enough mana to finish a full combo, the total being at least 80 of each mana, but you also want them slightly offset to trigger an additional effect from Verflare or Verholy. Basically, whichever mana you have less of, you want to cast the Verholy or Verflare that matches whichever one you have less of. You can also jump in and out of range of the boss using Core and Displacement respectively. Sometimes the backflip from Displacement can send you a little bit further than you may want, being especially dangerous to use in small arenas where you can backflip off the edge or into a death wall. In situations like this, you also have Engagement, which sacrifices a bit of potency in exchange for saving you from being on the front page of Reddit. Fortunately, Red Mage does have some other tools to help manipulate the speed of their mana generation. Acceleration ensures the next 3 spell casts will trigger their follow-up effect. For example, Thunder triggering access to Fire. This allows for rapid generation of mana. And for even more rapid generation is Manification, which doubles your current mana values, resets the cooldown on Core, Displacement, and Engagement, and even boosts your magic damage by 5% for the next 10 seconds. It's a great burst DPS setup tool and buff tool. That covers all the single target stuff, but what about AoE? Well, they have both a caster and melee AoE, depending on whether you want to generate or spend mana. Thunder 2 and Arrow 2 are both the basic black and white mana AoEs with normal cast times, similar to how Jolt works in single target. Impact, on the other hand, has a long cast time, so dual cast is used on this for your AoE. Now, there is a lot of optimization that goes in there, so experienced red mages, please forgive me, we're not diving into that. Check the guides below the video. Once you have some mana, you can use Enhanced Moulinet to spam in melee range for quick bursts of AoE damage. Rinse and repeat. Sorry for the pronunciation. Now, between this game of balance exist a few additional skills, and I apologize again for the pronunciation here. Fleche is an off-global cooldown ability to deal single target damage, and Contre Sixte is an AoE off-global cooldown. You'll be using these pretty much on cooldown. Another sword skill we didn't mention earlier is also Reprise, but this is a ranged attack that is mostly used during movement-intensive encounters. Its enhanced version uses up 5 of each mana, but it's so powerful after recent buffs that there's an acceptable amount of these you can use in between your melee combos, and it'll actually be a DPS gain, which allows you to handle movement in a much more fluid manner once you've mastered it. Finally, let's talk raid utility. They have a potent Vercure spell, which can be a real lifesaver that also gives Red Mage easy access to dual cast. So Vercure, you'd think you'd use it to save lives, but you seldom do this outside of absolute desperation or soloing certain content. So most people will use it when there's no enemies available to prep a dual cast proc. This then ties into their most popular utility, Verraise. Now, like Summoner, Red Mage has a combat resurrection with this spell. But since Red Mage has such frequent access to instant cast spells through dual cast, Verays can be used to chain resurrect teammates in desperate times. Don't get overzealous, Red Mages are not bottomless pits of MP, and while this utility is incredibly strong, it's more often utilized in more casual content when experiencing mass amounts of players being KO'd, such as exploration zones or 24-man raids. And to top it all off, Red Mage has Embolden, which not only boosts the Red Mage's magic damage by 10%, but also increases the party's physical damage by 10%, giving it great synergy with physical damage jobs. You'll primarily use this for the buff it provides your team in serious content, and avoid using it selfishly. This effect, though, oddly decays by 2% every 4 seconds, so it goes from 10% to 8% to 6% until the effect wears off after 20 seconds. Alright, the final job's pros. For one, it's probably the easiest of the 3 jobs to pick up and play at a casual level. Hardcore Red Mages know there's actually a lot of job optimization for players to master, so that also means there's a reasonable level of skill for you to gain between the floor and the ceiling. However, if you're not looking to do anything serious, you can probably pick this up and at least do casual content reliably. It's otherwise, pretty solid across the board. Its DPS got buffed recently, its mobility got buffed, and its utility, Verays, it's pretty good. The cons of the Red Mage, on the other hand, are a mix of taste and performance. While the job performs at an admirable level, it does fine in all content in the game, especially post-buff. It just doesn't have the same stopping power as Summoner or Black Mage. In fights that are ranged favored, you won't notice this as much, but in encounters where everyone has a lot of uptime, you'll quickly see Red Mage fall to just above the ranged physical roll, which is a lot lower than the other 2 caster DPS. Now, the community calls this the resurrection tax, taking a statement from the developers that the job's lower DPS is because of its ability to chain Verays. Honestly though, this is offset by MP limitations, and if an encounter is even recoverable by the time you've needed this many resurrections. Not to mention, you still have to have MP to do this, and all you have to recover it is Lucid Dreaming, the roll action, which if that's on cooldown and you die, you're sunk. Speaking of Verays, despite that utility being great in casual content, the job otherwise actually doesn't have much. Embolden is cool in parties with lots of physical damage, but its odd deteriorating nature and its ineffectiveness with other casters creates a synergy disparity. Finally, my personal opinion, I don't think the job's fun. This isn't a con. It isn't. I just don't think this job is fun, especially compared to the other 2 casters. Oh, yeah, I guess. Okay, I made the joke at the beginning, but in case you're wondering about Blue Mage before we wrap up, Blue Mage isn't a traditional caster DPS. It's what's called a limited job in Final Fantasy XIV, meaning it cannot reach the same job level as the other casters in this video. It has its own job progression, it has its own exclusive content, its own exclusive achievements, but it can't reach level 80 and it can't do any current endgame, so it isn't part of this video or discussion. I have made a bunch of Blue Mage videos though, both raid and guide videos, to help you learn more if you want to. Okay, so with that out of the way, who would I pick as my winner? My heart says Black Mage, but my brain wants me to go with Summoner. I think both perform exceptionally well, both come with intimidating drawbacks if a player messes up. Black Mage has no combat resurrection, but it's easier to recover on, while Summoner has party utility, but it can be quite overwhelming with its rigid rotations and timings, especially if you die during a very deep portion of your summoning phase. But I think at the end of the day, given optimal circumstances and play from both of them, I'm gonna give the win to Summoner. Rigidity aside, they are a consistently high-performing job with a clear beginning to end rotation, high mobility, and raid utility. I just can't give it to Black Mage. Black Mage's mobility requires such high fight and job understanding that with no raid utility, I'm just gonna have to push it down to second place. Red Mage was my clear third. Like, you guys all knew that. Again, the job performs fine. I've played with great Red Mages, but it just lacks the flair and polish of the other 2, even after some of its more recent buffs. And that is going to be a wrap for our caster versus for Final Fantasy XIV. Thank you so much for those of you who have had the patience to wait for this. I've lost a hard drive full of footage and effort. That totally killed my motivation. There's been a ton of game releases I've been diving into, and I really appreciate your support for still clicking on this video. If you enjoyed it, like, favorite, subscribe, comment below, share it with your friends. And the next one, I think we're doing tanks next, and then I'll end with melee DPS for 5.x. We'll see, because we might have job changes in 5.3 and on, so we may need to revisit some of these in the end. But thank you again so much for watching, and thank you to Ignis Fairfun for providing some footage for Summoner and Red Mage. I raided in 5.2 with him. That footage was supposed to be used in my 5.2 raid guides, and, well, you've seen what happened with those. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you all in the next one, and until then, take care.